if there is no God, everything is permitted. So I want to say, well, should we believe that? Why should we believe that? Why would anyone think, for example, consider any of the atrocities that we have sadly had to witness in this century, young as it still is? Think about 9/11, think about Darfur, or about the Congo, what's been happening there, or more recently, just very recently, fresh in our memories, what happened in Mumbai. And ask yourself, well, if there were no God, would all that be permitted? One question that might occur to you then is, well, what do you mean, permitted by whom? So, obviously, these actions, these atrocities, are not permitted by law in any nation, as far as I'm aware, these sorts of things. And even now internationally, we have a developing body of international law. We have an international criminal court which exists to make sure that even where these things, these crimes are not prosecuted in the country in which they're committed, that they are against international law and that people can be tried in the International Criminal Court, despite the best efforts of the professedly Christian administration of this country over the last 8 years to undermine the status of the International Criminal Court and to refuse to be part of it. So these things are not permitted by law, but of course we're not really talking about law, we're talking about morality. You might say, if you're a theist, that such acts are prohibited by God, and if there's no God, well, obviously they're permitted. Well, certainly it's true that if you're an atheist, you can't say they're prohibited by God. But first, the fact that theists can say that some acts are prohibited by God doesn't make it true that they are. And if there is no God, then it's obviously also not true that they're prohibited by God. That statement is false. There isn't a God in the sense of a God in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There are other gods about which perhaps I might have other doubts, but the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition is supposed to be a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good. And if you look at the world around us, indeed, if you look at some of the very events that I've been describing, I don't think there could be such a God in this world, because such a God would not permit these events to take place. Now, if you might say, well, these events that I've described occur through human free will, and for some reason that's a greater good than the evils that humans commit, that still doesn't resolve the problem, because there's also immense suffering that occurs without any intervention of human free will. For example, people die not only because they're killed by other humans, but they die in droughts, and they die in floods, and they die in earthquakes. And often these people are innocent of any conceivable sin because perhaps they're a year old, and they die slow, lingering deaths. And it's hard to see how that can be justified or defended by free will. And even if, although I think this is a repellent doctrine, you were to say they suffer because they too have original sin, since they are descended from Adam and Eve, as indeed some Christians would say, we still have the insoluble problem of the suffering of non-human animals who are not descended from Adam and Eve, do not take part in original sin, and yet suffer slow, lingering deaths in droughts and famines and earthquakes, just as humans do. So I think there is no reconciliation of the existence of that kind of suffering and the kind of God of the Christian and Jewish traditions. So I think that it's not a good argument to say that these things are not permitted because God prohibits them, because you would need to defend the idea that such a God exists. So I think that the question, can there be morality without God, really comes to a question of, can there be morality given that we are in a universe without God? But of course we can suspend our disbelief in God and ask questions about what difference would it make to morality if there were a God?
I suppose you could say there is at least one positive reason why I don't believe in God and two negative reasons. The positive reason is the one that was reputed to have been uttered by Laplace when the Emperor Napoleon asked him where God figured in his account of the cosmos. And Laplace famously replied, "I had no need of that hypothesis." In other words, to Laplace, the universe was sufficiently explicable without positing a God, or at least no more explicable if we do posit one. So why do so? We do not need to believe in God in order to explain the universe, and belief in God does not really help us to explain it. Why do people believe in God? Well, I'm asking that as a philosophical question rather than a psychological question. There may be some psychological needs for people to believe in God, but looking at that as more as a philosophical question, we could say that in the Christian tradition, particularly in medieval times, the tradition attempted to develop rational arguments for the existence of God. And to some extent that still exists among Roman Catholic circles. I'll mention three of those famous arguments. There's the first cause argument, that you need to believe in God to answer the question, what caused the universe to exist? And the answer is, of course, God created it. John says he believes. We're talking about the biblical God, the God who is supposed to have created the world. Secondly, the ontological argument, which works from the definition of God as a being with all the perfections. And thirdly, the argument from design, that the world shows signs of having been designed by a God. Let me briefly look at these. The first cause argument is sometimes today resurrected as something that is compatible with science, because people sometimes say, haven't we learnt through science that the universe began with a big bang, that it began around 13 billion years ago? John, I think, said that it was created from nothing, or he quoted a scientist saying it was created from nothing. And how could that happen? How can you create something from nothing? Doesn't that suggest that there has to be a God? But I think scientists are guilty of sowing a great deal of confusion when they use the word universe in statements such as the universe began 13 billion years ago with the Big Bang. If you actually tackle a physicist who studies this issue and ask, what do you really mean by the universe in that statement? They will tell you, if they're honest, that what they're talking about is the observable universe, or the known universe. The universe that we can observe with our telescopes and all the devices we have seems to have begun from some kind of bang, if you like, development about 13 billion years ago, and to have been expanding ever since. But if you ask the scientist, well, do we know that it began from nothing? They will answer, no, we don't know that at all. We can't observe anything before the Big Bang. So any statements about what the situation was before the Big Bang are not scientific statements. They are statements perhaps of religious faith or belief. So it may well be that the universe, for example, has been constantly oscillating, been constantly expanding and then collapsing and then expanding again, and it's been doing that forever, for infinite time. That's perfectly compatible with everything that science can tell us. So we don't need a God to explain the beginning of the universe. The universe may have always existed. And indeed, if we think that, as the first cause argument runs, everything has to have a first cause, then of course that argument applies to God as well. If we're allowed to say God needs no first cause, then we ought to be allowed to say the universe needs no first cause. The ontological argument, briefly stated, is that we define God as a being who has all of the perfections, all of the possible perfections. That means a God who is supremely whatever qualities you can think of as being perfect: beautiful, wise, good, powerful, and so on. But then it's claimed that if this God did not exist, that would be a failing, that would be a lack. So this perfect being would lack something, namely existence, therefore God must exist. Well, very, very few philosophers nowadays believe that argument. Thirdly, the argument from design was once quite a powerful argument. It's the watchmaker's argument. Richard Dawkins has a book, The Blind Watchmaker, that says, well, you know, if things happen by evolution, how could they all fit together so well? It seems like everything works well in the universe. There are signs of things having been designed. Certainly people of the past thought that animals were created for us to eat and for us to wear their skins, and they pointed to other things in nature like the fact that if water did not expand when it froze, then ponds would freeze solid and fish would die and so on. There are things that people regarded as being beautifully designed, including our own organs and the organs of animals, which seem to have certain functions and purposes. But of course, now that we understand the Darwinian theory of evolution, that argument has fallen into disrepute. We understand much better how it is that we have certain organs, how it is that beings exist, that they have evolved over barely imaginable periods of time. Only those that were indeed adapted to their environment and could survive and reproduce left descendants that are still with us. And I think the fossil record now shows that, and more recently our understanding of genetics shows our own biological relationship with very simple organisms, including bacteria with whom we share some genes, and then progressively we share more genes with beings more like us until we get up to the great apes, chimpanzees, with whom we share something like 98% of our genes. So I think evolution is one of the most firmly established scientific theories with a huge amount of evidence for it, and we don't therefore need the argument from design to explain how the universe comes to be like it is.